Thank you to the leadership of NJBIC for extending an invitation to me to participate in this important discussion at the annual legislative conference, which brings together experts from across fields to address critical issues that affect Black communities around our state. For us, this is a process that we started on day one of our administration, and it's a process that starts with a simple acknowledgement. We must all acknowledge that we do our work in the criminal justice system, in law enforcement, against the backdrop of 400 years of trauma and 400 years of history. And that's the history of slavery and Reconstruction, of Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement, and of the war on drugs and mass incarceration. A history that's resulted in deep systemic and implicit biases. Biases that have fueled disparities in not only incarceration rates, but also in how force is used by law enforcement against Black and brown communities. Against this backdrop, is there any wonder why so many believe that there are two systems of justice in this country? Is there any wonder why there's a crisis in confidence in policing right now, or why many don't trust law enforcement? Listen, none of this is abstract. Nearly 1 year after George Floyd's murder, we are still faced with growing concerns about policing equity. Reflecting on last year's national reckoning on issues of race and justice, with millions of Americans taking to the streets to demand that we once and for all acknowledge our history of injustice against Black Americans, that we ensure that law enforcement treat all citizens equally, that we dismantle systemic racism in all of its pernicious forms, especially in policing, and that we do all we can to truly make Black lives matter. This is precisely what we've been doing in New Jersey. But we started this hard work well before the tragic events of last summer, because we want to keep New Jersey at the top among all law enforcement in the country. One example of our work relates to implicit bias. I think we can all agree that we all have implicit biases, those unconscious and often subtle associations we make in our minds about groups of people, and the stereotyping of certain groups. In some cases, resulting in part from that 400+ years of history that I mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, some of us aren't even aware that we carry these implicit biases with us. So when prosecutors, detectives, and police officers bring their unchecked, implicit biases to their work, the outcomes can be horrendous for persons of color. So that's why in 2019, I mandated implicit bias training for all New Jersey State Police troopers, all prosecutors and detectives employed by our Division of Criminal Justice, and all prosecutors and detectives employed by the 21 county prosecutors' offices statewide. And I am pleased to say that the governor recently signed a law mandating implicit bias training for all state law enforcement. This was a necessary step to take to mandate this training because it helps law enforcement statewide understand how aspects of bias can influence their actions. So when they go about their jobs, they can start to see for themselves where their own unconscious biases may creep in, and they can then work to minimize their effects. This lays the groundwork to help us achieve fairer and more just prosecutions. Another important step in our efforts to build an anti-racist system of justice is to completely reimagine policing in our state. We announced an overhaul to New Jersey's use of force policy, which the Atlantic magazine has called the nation's most ambitious police reform effort. This may be the single most important thing I'll do as State Attorney General. Simply put, we're demanding different and better outcomes for all police interactions, and our efforts focus on 3 areas. First, we're helping officers avoid situations where the use of force is necessary. We're doing that by overhauling police training and improving police culture. You see, we want our officers to shift from a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality. And we're paying closer attention to the psychological well-being of our officers to ensure that they remain resilient in the face of today's many, many challenges. But we're also using state-of-the-art early warning systems to help identify at-risk officers earlier so we can intervene before problems escalate. Second, we're placing strict limits on when and how officers may use force. We're doing this to avoid the unnecessary use of force. We're banning all forms of physical force against civilians, except as a last resort, and only after the officer attempts to de-escalate the situation. So we're prohibiting officers from firing weapons at moving vehicles or from moving vehicles. We're prohibiting officers from engaging in high-speed car chases, except under the narrowest of circumstances. Listen, these are common sense changes that will promote both public and law enforcement safety. we're also helping officers identify signs of mental illness so that they can more appropriately respond to individuals who don't present a threat to others. And we're establishing an affirmative duty, one that requires all officers, regardless of their rank, title, or seniority, to intercede if they observe another officer engage in illegal or excessive force. We simply won't let those scenes that we saw in Minneapolis last summer, when 3 officers stood by and did nothing while a 4th killed a human being, take place in this state. Third, for those rare cases when force is used, we're reviewing each and every incident and sharing information about them publicly to ensure both accountability and transparency. We're requiring officers to submit detailed information to an online portal about every use of force within 24 hours of the incident, and then we're mandating that their supervisors review all of them. And recently, we made a version of that portal available to the public, including the raw data that we've collected on use of force incidents. You can test the portal and give us feedback at njoag.gov/force. For more serious incidents, including officer-involved shootings and deaths in custody, we've also established robust protocols to ensure independent grand jury investigations and the prompt release of body-worn camera footage. We've also revised the rules governing the police internal disciplinary process to ensure that officers are held accountable, even in those cases that don't result in criminal charges. We've also issued a series of new directives that are designed to strengthen trust between law enforcement and historically marginalized communities, including immigrants, LGBTQ individuals, at-risk juveniles, and the victims of sexual assault. This is just a snapshot, but I encourage you to go to njoag.gov/policing to learn more about all the steps we've taken to promote professionalism, transparency, and accountability among New Jersey law enforcement. And finally, I want to highlight how in New Jersey we adhere to and advance prosecutorial best practices. We are on the front lines of criminal justice reform, and I'm proud to say that we've implemented implicit bias training, as I've discussed, for our prosecutors. We've changed culture. We've improved internal discipline, data transparency. We've created a conviction review unit. We've enacted restorative justice programs and practices, and bail reform, to name just a few. And the work we are doing is beyond what any other state is doing as a whole. States are looking to change their own practices and policies by looking to us here in New Jersey as they contemplate similar changes. There is clearly much, much more work that needs to be done, but I'm committed to doing it and to making New Jersey fairer, safer, and stronger. And I know that all of you are too, because you've convened this important conference today. But the work must continue beyond today if we truly want to dismantle systemic racism and build trust between law enforcement and the communities we serve. It's our hope that many of our policing policies will be codified through legislation. That is the path of lasting reform. So thank you for doing your part, because it inspires us to continue to do ours. Please stay safe.